Good afternoon, everyone. This is Barbara Petroselli at Podium Data. Thank you for joining our webinar, Preparing Enterprise Data for Cloud Migration. We have an hour set aside today, and we're going to try and keep this super interactive. So a couple housekeeping points. First of all, we are recording today's webinar, and I will send around a link to the recording probably tomorrow. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, send me a little text through the chat window there, and I will provide you a PDF of those. And in general, if you have any questions as we are going through this today, ask your questions live, and I will bunch them up and interrupt our speaker at appropriate times so we can keep this super interactive. That said, I want to introduce our speaker. Bob Becchione is one of Podium Data's founders. So he is our Chief Technology Officer and has really been a formative leader in the solution and the product and its strategic direction since inception, so for a number of years here. And what he's going to talk about today is about some of the considerations and topics that you might want to take into consideration as you think about preparing enterprise data assets for migration to cloud. So having said that, Bob, why don't you take it away?
All right, thanks, Barbara. Thank you, everybody, for joining. For those of you who are repeat Bob V webinars, thanks again. Just from a timing perspective, so folks can stay engaged and attentive, the expectation is the slides that we'll go through and the discussion that we'll have will be about 30 minutes, leaving some time at the end for Q&A. And as Barbara said, this will all be available. The content will be made available after the webinar for folks to review later. And what we're specifically going to walk through in today's session, we'll discuss concerns that we see with our customers, prospects, as well as some of the industry experts. When you start really thinking about and even taking the cloud journey with your data and applications, we're also going to talk about approaches on how to get there, what to avoid. There's no better way to talk about that than to have experienced both success and failure and some difficulties along the way. We'll talk about what may help mitigate the risk depending upon your situation. We are also going to talk about, and here's the sell part, right? So those first two bullets are clearly geared towards kind of generic conversations, generic processes and approaches, but we will absolutely talk about the Podium catalog and what we call our smart and actionable catalog and how that really enables this, and ultimately the concepts there are applicable irrespective of Podium, but that we will spend quite a bit of time talking about that. And then we'll go through some deployment options. We will talk about combination on-prem and cloud, a la hybrid or all cloud, and how that kind of manifests itself. So those will be the topics. Again, we'll get through this in about 30 minutes and open it up for questions. So again, thank you everybody for your time today. So as we dive into this, there's some interesting data points out there that have been captured, and this is a really interesting set of basically reasons and business goals and things like that of why folks are actually migrating their enterprise data and applications to the cloud. And there's certainly the obvious ones, such as the lower the TCO, the total cost of ownership, and that's a key driver a lot of times. But what we certainly see as well as lowering TCO is this notion of kind of agile data development, and we're going to talk about that a lot. And if you notice, a couple of these reasons in the top half here have to do with speed of development. And what we have found with our customers is, speed of development, frankly, is less about the technology and more about, thinking of these processes as a new way to deliver data to the businesses. So that's going to be an important theme as we go throughout the next 30 minutes here. But the ability to actually provide, I'm sure the folks listening to this have some level of categorization as to why they're considering the cloud. We've actually had customers who are considering the cloud because, some high-level management dictates it because that kind of seems to be the right thing to do with not even any business justification yet. So we're going to talk about some of those important business justifications. So again, plenty of reasons, plenty of good reasons. The level of maturity exists such that pretty much anything you're doing on-prem really can be kind of manifests itself from a functionality perspective in the cloud. All right, so here are some of the things that we've run into over the years, and we really want to talk about this and tease this apart a little bit. So we've certainly worked with customers, and from a project perspective within Podium, pre-Podium, about, well, what do I want to actually move to the cloud? And oftentimes we see that the first thought is this concept of lift and shift, right? Lift and shift meaning that, hey, we have a data warehouse that is sitting on expensive hardware and expensive applications, and we want to be cheaper and move to the cloud. And that's really this kind of massive move or a lift and shift. Transactional systems that encompass system of record, or hey, we actually now have a fairly mature data lake, and we want to move away from Hadoop, or we again want to do some cost takeout and move that into the data lake, or a full analytics platform. Now, the truth is, as you embark on this journey, starting with this kind of big bang, massive lift and shift, really may marginalize or kind of in combination with marginalizing the value of the cloud, and you'll see why we say that in a minute, but also risking success. And we're going to talk about why that is. So from a marginalization perspective, right, the cautionary tale here is to do that true migration, and we'll pick on the data warehouse example to the cloud, you're typically migrating all of the data consumption access patterns, right? And you're trying to do that in a way that you can meet or beat your current service level agreements from a performance and availability perspective with all the required data, right? And of course, how do I know what's in my data before I embark on this? That's going to be another important theme that we're going to focus on and talk about quite a bit here. But the challenge and the risk associated with this kind of massive lift and shift as one of your first efforts is, the truth is the total cost of ownership may not be as compelling as you think it is. Typical existing systems, as you think about warehouses or other massive platforms like that, there may be some level of availability that requires some significant compute cycles on the cloud be available all the time. And again, that certainly is going to start to eat into that margin of cost of ownership. The time to value by doing one of these massive things is significant, right? So before an organization actually ever, is able to kind of garner any of the benefits from moving to the cloud, it literally might be, 12 months or longer, years to actually get there. And if you think about kind of this lift and shift, you're thinking about moving all the processes. If there's data transformations and classic ETL, if there's applications that need to be connected, those are all very significant things. And again, marginalizing the value, because the truth is, when you actually deliver that to the end users, what are the end users and business benefits going to be realized from that after a fair amount of time? And then, of course, data security, one of the major concerns from a lot of our customers, and we have fairly data sensitive customers in the large kind of insurance and financial areas. So that's always an associated risk. So let's talk about TCO for a minute. Anytime you put numbers up on a slide, whether you're in a meeting or in a webinar like this, the focus is certainly going to be on the minutia of the numbers, but that's not the point of this slide, right? There is an important point here. So as we kind of go through an example of the cloud, and we're not focusing on AWS or Google, but in this case, we took our own kind of calculator internally and came up with some real calculations based on usage, and just to show the difference between the advantage of taking the value of taking advantage of compute elasticity in the cloud versus non, right? So if you do simple estimates, and again, you can do your own math, but if you take simple estimates of, hey, my system really needs to be up 9 to 5, 5 days a week, versus having compute cycles available to me, 7 by 24. You can see that the costs under two categories here, a small implementation and a large implementation, go up by factors. Certainly not orders of magnitude, but factors. And why this is important is, if you go back to kind of the concept of this massive platform lift and shift, I can tell you in our experience, most times you do actually have to have a more closer to the 7 by 24 availability rather than the elastic availability that is really going to start to get where you're going to start to drive a lot of your value. So what's the mitigation here? Understand the usage patterns, right? If you've started down the cloud path and you want to see a big win, understand those usage patterns of whatever project initiative or set of projects you're looking at, and understand the elasticity of that requirements of that application. The more elastic it can be, the more likely you're going to realize a significant improvement in total cost of ownership. All right, so now let's talk about the time to value risk that we mentioned earlier, right? So any data delivery project from a business benefit perspective, you have to ask yourself, how do we get there and fast, right? This is not necessary, while a lot of cloud initiatives that we see and work with are frankly IT and technology driven, the truth is, in order to get full complete sign-in, you have to get the business on board. You have to get the business, completely bought in. And one of the ways you do that is you provide this value in a very fast way. And part of providing the value in a very fast way is, we like to apply our internal software development model to data, which is having an iterative, agile delivery model, right? So you have the business-driven, starts with knowing the usage patterns and the data, and then you actually have a fast and secure way of delivering data. And this really has to be agile. And the reason it has to be agile is part of the data agility and being able to deliver something to the cloud is having what we call even a shared joint development experience with the technology and business team. So you have users, you have data, they're actually trying to understand what they need to move, what data do I actually require to move, and if I'm wrong, can I change that quickly if I need to? Because a lot of times you're looking at something, you're looking at requirements, and they may morph over time. So having these kind of joint application development experience with an agile model really drives the agility into being able to deliver quickly. And then as a part of that experience, when you're working with, again, the business value here, you need a trusted place to start from, right? You need a place where you either have your entire enterprise cataloged, which, may sound daunting to some folks, but it's not as daunting as you think, or even a subset of that catalog such that the users can kind of see and feel and touch before that process of movement begins. Now, let's talk about, well, Bob, if you're talking about not these, massive lift and shift, which are really nice and easy to quantify that everything here is now there and I'm done, that's great. But what are some of the important considerations when we're actually selecting an effort or initiative to move to the cloud as we're trying to take baby steps? And, first thing is, can the success of this project be readily measured, right? Again, moving data for the sake of moving data is not necessarily success. But if you can actually have business users define return on investment or cost takeout, tangible cost takeout, then you can measure that success, right? And then can the processes that either feed the current application that's being moved, or the processes that you may need to build to support a new effort or application, can they really be offloaded, right? So do you have ETL processes or application logic? So those are important considerations when you're doing that. Now, the truth is, let's not shy away from the hard stuff here, but let's actually start at a place that we know is going to get momentum and success. So some examples are, and we've seen some successful examples in both of these where you may have some operational reporting, via a BI tool. And the input to that operational reporting is fairly well defined. They're kind of a turn the crank lights out. And the key win might be a significant cost takeout. And I'm going to give you some real examples here because, we have a customer, for example, that is doing this exact thing. and they have a very expensive end-of-life technology, and I'll tell you what it is. It's a Netezza technology that they are actually doing a cost takeout, and they are looking at exactly this use case. Not only is a cost takeout of value here, but it also gives them flexible growth, right? So they can actually continue to add data and literally do it on the fly, right? And that's compared to trying to do this internally, where you have to make a request for more nodes, more space, and we again, with the customers we work with, that is not a quick process, right? As opposed to going to the cloud, where you can spin things up pretty readily. Another example is regulatory requirements. So we also have customers that have a lot of, I would say, cold storage, but colder storage systems that when, you know, there's some legal requirement that they have to go back and look at time at specific data. These systems have to be running. They have to be constantly updated with source level data. Not a lot of transformations going on here, but really source level data. The cost of this growing internally becomes pretty prohibitive. There's a huge win. This is bigger than a big win. There's a huge win with cost takeout here because of the economics of cold storage, as well as that elastic compute on the cloud is very evident here, right? So you don't even have to spin up compute unless you actually have to start querying those regulatory requirements. So some really good examples here, rather than the concept of the complex lift and shift. All right, so the other risk mitigator that we talked about very briefly, which are data concerns, right? So again, real live data here, and you can see how the concerns have grown over the last few years. Certainly some of and we see this today, and completely understandable, about concerns of where the data is stored, concerns about security. How do I get there? How do I, know what's going on with it? And that's really important. Now, there's an interesting third one here, folks, that I want you to look at. The cloud promise of cost of ownership and flexibility, it's all real. It's all true. But we have also seen where, customers have moved to the cloud, and suddenly, while it doesn't seem like they're locked into a vendor, they really are, right? And I'm going to give you an example. So you guys probably are on the same email list that I'm on, with some of the Hadoop distribution vendors, and there's an interesting email that I got right about the same time as this webinar about one of the large distribution vendors talking about cloud stuff. And if you look at it, they're talking about cloud stuff specifically with Amazon and specifically with a large services organization, right? So that means, their view of this is, hey, we're going to go to Amazon, that's a cloud, everything's going to be better. But there are concerns about, well, if I'm locked into Amazon or locked into Azure or locked into Google or SoftLayer, what does that actually mean to me, right? So that's kind of a little hidden concern or fact that they're not sure, where you guys will fall in this list of things here. So we're quite sure the top 3 or 4 here are across the group of participants in this webinar today. All right, so where do we start? So this is all great, Bob, but where do we start? So here's where we're going to, really get into some of the important kind of, risk mitigators, right? And from our perspective, the place to start, the place that drives success is knowing your data. And really, to do that, you have to build a smart, actionable catalog. Okay, this is not just building a catalog, and we're gonna talk about why it's different. And what really does that mean? Well, it means that as I'm building this catalog in real time, I can actually automatically classify data from a rules-driven place, right? So I can classify data that might be sensitive, but it's not just PII or PCI detection. It's also, understanding your business data domains. For insurance companies, it might be important to classify data that's policy-related or claim-related. It might be important to understand if I'm actually pulling a policy identifier. It may not be classic PII data, but these are all the things that really tie into being able to classify your data. Well, how about if I get duplicate data across my organization, right? And I'm specifically looking to move data to the cloud. Boy, it would really be nice to know if I have duplicate data, then tease that apart and understand what the true source is, and ultimately that's what you're going to want to use from a migration perspective. And then actionable. We're going to talk a lot about actionable. So actionable means that when you are in the catalog, you can actually not only look at all of those classifications and look at all of that, stuff that is about my data, but you can actually do something with the data. Maybe you do need to transform it before it goes to the cloud, or transform it on the cloud. Maybe you need to publish it to other external places, multiple clusters, multiple cloud destinations, all of that. That is an actionable catalog. That is not just looking at metadata, but is actually doing something with that data. And this all has to be efficient. It all has to be operational and secure. And efficient means, again, you have 1,000 sources of data. How can I really create a catalog that tells me everything I've got out there? And, efficiency can mean hours and days, maybe even a week. And that's kind of how we measure, fully cataloging enterprises. And now, why should this be your starting point as opposed to just going to the old kind of requirements gathering, what data meets my requirements, I think, and then moving down that path? Well, this actually immediately lets you understand what your data is and mitigate those data sensitivity risks, right? This doesn't mean you don't put sensitive data on the cloud. I can tell you Podium is very comfortable with the security on the cloud, and that's not the issue. But understanding what you are moving there is really important. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I just, spun up a system on AWS and you can start running queries, and somebody asks you, well, do I have any, personally identifiable information out there? You better be able to answer that question, right? The other reason this should be your starting point is we talked about agility and speed to delivery. We don't think, and we feel very strongly about this, that you can have an agile joint development process that allows you to iterate on your data without this concept, without the concept of understanding your data and having the ability to take action on that. And then, of course, don't want to overlook the ability to accurately identify the data that is required for this initiative, right? So ultimately, you found out what you want to do. Now you need the data, and you can accurately identify that data. So that really is, the starting point. Why this works is, and this is a Podium-specific catalog slide, so keep that in mind. But the reason this works is Podium actually is leveraging source-level metadata. As a part of this cataloging, we are actually doing, all the validation stuff that I'm sure some of those repeat webinar folks out there have heard me talk about over and over again. All of this statistical profiling, this classification and PII detection, and this really enables data governance, right? So Podium is not a data governance tool, but we are providing all of the important data that enable you to govern that data. And you can also, apply business level metadata to this technical metadata. Podium actually tracks all of the lineage within this process. So these are some of the important factors of what actually goes into this smart catalog.
Can I interrupt you, Bob, with a question?
Absolutely.
So a question came in, and I'll paraphrase here, basically that this organization is a smaller organization, and they actually are generating a lot of their data in the cloud by using cloud-based applications.
Yep.
And how does that relate to this, if they're looking to integrate that with on-prem data or other systems?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So from a Podium, and I'll segue into a Podium-specific answer to this. Podium actually doesn't care where the data lives, doesn't care what the source is. We're source agnostic. More importantly, to this kind of, the answer to this question is, our experience with application-generated data is sometimes, and this may be the case for the person who asked the question, it may not be, but a lot of times the application-generated data is in the form of JSON or some other complicated hierarchical structure that is produced by the application. Podium does not just catalog your kind of simple data, right? The kind of CSV and RDBMS, but our focus is actually on the harder data. So the quick answer, although it's too late for a quick answer, is we don't really care what the source of the data is. We can actually We can actually catalog your data that's generated in the cloud without making a copy of that data. And that data, again, still remains actionable even though it's in its original point, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, probably a little long-winded there. Sorry, folks. So what does the catalog first approach really enable, right? So these are some important points, folks, so kind of bear with me here. But this really gives you the ability to know what you have, and know what you have, not just from a sensitivity perspective, but data quality perspective. And you know, again, I brought up the example of duplicate data, but the other example is if you're moving data into the cloud that has poor quality, lots of blanks, lots of issues, those are things that need to be understood before that. And this also really gives you the ability to do an accurate plan for the project, right? So an accurate plan, you know, most enterprise data projects I've been on over the last 30 years negates to put time in the projects for understanding the data, the profiling, you know, what the applications or what the data models or any of that stuff needs to know about the data. This approach absolutely gives you the ability to say, hey, we need a week to do X, Y, or Z because this is what we found out about our data. And you can also, as you're looking at the data and you identify the data, you can define your security model, which will drive the access controls. You know, you'll have a better understanding of what those security groups may need to look like on the cloud based on the data that's being put out there. The other thing with an actionable smart catalog, and again, this is Podium specific, right? You have the ability to automate the synchronization between on-prem sources, cloud sources, on-prem processing, and cloud processing, right? So this kind of looks like that hybrid model. So again, from an actionable catalog perspective, it can be the gateway to all of this, and that's actually pretty important as well. It really does let you take advantage of elasticity, right? So let's talk about this one for a minute. We're going to talk about this and show you some examples at the end if I don't go on too long. But here's an interesting example. You put data out on the cloud. You put it in S3. You put it in, you know, Azure ADLS. You know, choose your storage. And maybe you have an app on there. Maybe you're moving it to a relational database on the cloud. How do you actually access that data? The way the Podium catalog works is you can actually see everything, including sample data and profiling data, all of that, without spinning up a set of compute cycles. So you can actually do a bunch of stuff to that data in a really easy way to kind of look and find without having to spin anything up. So that really does give you a huge advantage to manage your elasticity if that's a requirement. And it ensures portability, right? So the concept of vendor lock-in, and I know what you're thinking, well, vendor lock-in, but Podium, we're talking about Podium. Well, there's a big difference between a Podium catalog and locking in all of your data and your application processing onto one of the cloud vendors. Podium has actually done this with a customer where we've actually moved them from cloud to cloud, literally in hours, and that is no exaggeration. How were we able to do that? Again, our catalog is completely metadata driven. So when they wanted to go to, I won't say who, when they wanted to go to cloud provider X to cloud provider Y, Podium knew where all the sources were. Podium knew what was in the target, and we're able to actually migrate everything. Again, yep, you've got Podium as a vendor, but all our stuff is kind of stored and available in an open way. And again, we can talk about that more as a follow-up. All right, I'm going to be conscious of the time here because I think I'm probably going longer than I expected. So the how, okay? I've talked about a lot of really good things here, but is it really realistic to build this smart catalog in a way that it can be done? And Podium, how do you do that, right? So from a process perspective, I'm not going to go through every step here, but our process of cataloging really drives a couple of things. One is we start with technical metadata, and again, we really focus on hard data as well as the simple data. And it's, again, not just the easy stuff, including RDBMSs, but it really is some of these hard hierarchical things. All within a single kind of scan of that data, if you will, we do all of these steps. We format it, we understand the data, we determine the dirtiness of the data, We can even secure the data from an encryption perspective, processing header trailers, also using those headers and trailers within your source systems to do additional validation such as record counts. And we can also provide a rules-based classification such that you can organize your data, right? So you can create user-driven rules that say, this is my policy data. I want to classify that as policy. So when I search for policy, it shows up. This is how it is done. Within the Podium framework, this is a single pass of the data that runs on whatever cluster you want to run it on, whether it's, again, on-prem or in the cloud, and Podium can manage both of those. So that's a big how. It's a lot of words there, but again, we can drive deeper. All right, so now that I've created a catalog, and again, maybe you haven't done your whole enterprise data set, but maybe you've done a lot of them, how do I actually get to my next step of this project, right? Where I actually want to review what I have out there. I want to actually create some planning for joint application development with my business users. And what does this catalog actually enable me to do? Well, here's a couple of screenshots, right? So from a Podium catalog perspective, you can actually drive the data in the catalog from what we call data key performance indicators, right? So folks are used to business key performance indicators. From a Podium perspective, you can configure your own performance indicators for your data, and that becomes available within the catalog. So you can actually look at a popularity score of the data. You can look at a data quality score, which Podium will generate, completely configurable, as well as an operational score. How old? What is the recency frequency of the data? All of that stuff is at your fingertips. Now, one of the key important kind of factors here as you look at these screenshots is a big difference between kind of what other folks do is with Podium, the catalog and the metadata sit side by side with the data. And that's whether Podium is managing the data or not. And we're going to talk about management and registration in a little bit. But you can also look at, the profiling statistics of the data in a summary screenshot. And then finally, once you've kind of auto-cataloged your data, you can create a set of reports however you want to report on that data. So for example, you can report on the data from a data shift perspective, and maybe you want to set up cataloging over a data source for a week so you can understand data drift, you can understand quality and things like that. All of that is at your fingertips. So as technology teams are sitting with business teams and doing this kind of joint application requirements, being able to actually sit there in a screen, this is what we've done, and drive that becomes a critical success factor.
Bob, can I interrupt you with a question?
Absolutely.
Question is, we use IBM IGC as our catalog, our current catalog standard, and how would Podium connect with that or be synchronized or complement it?
So great question. So as I mentioned a minute ago, one of the key distinctions is Podium is, again, data and metadata are both a first-class citizens within Podium. What makes the actionable part of the catalog actionable is the fact that we not only know about the data, we know how to operate on the data and do stuff with the data. We actually consider ourselves a really good integration with IGC, and we, in fact, have an integration with IGC because IGC is a much larger governance metadata tool that may have things like business glossary terms that Podium wants to integrate with. So I would just simply say that IGC is a much more metadata-driven, less data action tool than Podium is, and we have a really good coexistence at existing customers. Great question.
There's one other question here too, which has to do with volume of sources. Basically, it's how large, how many sources can potentially be cataloged. When does it become untenable?
Yeah, so that's the tough question, right? And I'm sure that's the one that a lot of people are thinking about. I'm glad that came in now rather than at the end, right? So to repeat the question, again, Bob, you're talking about cataloging all of these enterprise systems. When does it become inefficient, or when does it just kind of collapse on itself because there's so many objects there? And the truth is that's hard to answer, right? From a Podium processing perspective, some of our secret sauce under the covers is the ability to actually catalog this stuff, including significant, hundreds of terabytes, petabytes of data very quickly, depending upon that compute size, that cluster size, right? So there's a variable there in compute and cluster size. The other factor is in the organization, right? So the organization of the data, once it's auto-classified, which is a huge help in being able to find that data, still can become pretty complicated, right, as far as what you search. And the way Podium actually handles that is, if you kind of look at the screenshot on the left or the right, you can see that you can register those sources pretty quickly, and then on the right, you're producing this catalog, and that catalog can actually be grouped and sorted by domain, by user, and by access. So it really depends on the use case. It's a great question, and I will say we have customers that have, I think our largest catalog that we see out there is about 1,500 sources and 300,000 what we call entities of data that are run on a daily basis. So it does get pretty significant. All right, so finally, let's talk about deployment. We're going to drill onto this a little bit more, right? Because while we're oversimplifying this, we know that there's some complexity here. So from a smart catalog perspective, again, from a Podium catalog perspective, operational deployment, it really needs to be supported, in our view, from the catalog through production. There are absolutely alternatives to this, and we'll talk about that. But the ability to be able to register sources, you can see all the different types of sources you can register through this catalog to an action where you can publish that data wherever you want to publish that data. And then finally, actually turn the crank, put it into an automated production path. All, again, all from this kind of non-programming, non-ETL interface is really where we believe you're going to get the agility in deployment. So what makes this actionable, right? So we talked about the catalog coexisting with the data, right? So this includes all the lineage. This includes information about the target, information about the source. And examples of that is if you've got mainframe data, Podium knows that, the mainframe data type was a PIC XS9, and that may have some importance to some folks, and we know that the target is going to be a string or an integer, or whatever that is mapped to automatically within Podium. The data is sourced, right? So that data that Podium is cataloged, it can be registered or managed. This is an important concept. You do not have to make copies of data within Podium. When you're building the catalog, you can just tell Podium to, hey, Podium, go do this, run it on my cluster, wherever you're pointing the compute to, but don't make a copy of it. But keep all of that good stuff that you capture so I can look at my data, including optionally creating sample data for users to do stuff with. That's a really important thing from a cost perspective, being able to just register all of your data and not have to do anything with it from a management perspective until you actually need to take action on that. The other actionable piece here is being able to transform that data or prepare data or publish data from the catalog, right? So you don't have to go anywhere else. It's not telling you, hey, that data is from your Oracle source, go log into Oracle. And then, of course, the platform has to be fully operationalized, right? So from a lights out automated perspective, you have to be able to push this stuff to the cloud, whether it's hybrid or not. And the agility really is built in when you talk about this actionable catalog.
Let me add one thing to what you said, Bob, that just is occurring to me now, which is that point about being able to integrate a source into the catalog fully, but then essentially not store the data is another great example of where we can optimize the use of elasticity and cost savings. Because in looking at some of the models for this, which we've been doing quite a bit, S3 can become costly. It allows you to avoid excessive storage of data that you really don't need to have in the cloud.
That's very true. So, basically what Barbara said is, look, users can probably do most of their stuff within the Podium server on a small scale until they need to kind of ramp it up. And that's what we actually provide. That is another actual kind of actionable item here. So let's talk about a couple of, again, I'm sorry, I'm being conscious of the time here, so I'll speed through the last few slides, but we're going to talk about the different deployment models here, right? So the different deployment models, we'll talk about hybrid. Hybrid seems to be what a lot of people talk about. This is actually pretty common from a Podium perspective. And I you can envision this concept where the Podium kind of catalog and marketplace is actually on-prem. And by having that on-prem, there's some really neat advantages. One is that catalog becomes the gateway to the cloud, right? So you're connecting to the sources if they're on-prem, and you can connect to off-prem sources as well, but that's all managed within your infrastructure if that's kind of a concern. And then, of course, everything can be, kind of segued or published out to that cloud. So this is a very common model we see, and we do see lots of advantages to this model.
There's a question, Bob, from one of our folks. Do you support metadata information versioning?
So Podium supports what we call schema versioning, and I don't know if that's where the question is focused on. So we have the ability, and I'll give you a simple example to answer this question. If you are pulling data, let's say from an Oracle table, and yesterday that table had 7 columns, and tomorrow you actually go to catalog it again, or you go to do something with it, Podium actually has by default what we call a validation that says, oh, this looks different than yesterday's data. And in fact, Podium will not catalog it until you take some action on that. And actions on that could be you actually go ahead and add a new field, or you make the schema change yourself. So that's kind of a technical metadata versioning. The other example of what you're asking, is there a business metadata versioning that maybe today the business term changed, and what does that mean? In that example, we do not support that. We actually rely on integrations with a glossary tool like IGC that we talked about earlier. That's a good question.
One more question on that, Bob. What about the idea that you could onboard a data source, run the profiling and validation, generate a set of metadata about that source, and then when you run it through a prepared job and change it in some way, you can regenerate the metadata. So in a way, you're reproducing the profile data at each step as the data moves forward.
Yep. No, and I think that's a really good example. I mean, the one thing I want to be clear, I mean, it's a really good question. You will not see within the Podium catalog and again, go back to my example where the customer table changed from yesterday to today. You will not automatically see yesterday's customer, table and today's customer table. We're going to know that yesterday's was changed, but there is some kind of what we call automated API intervention that needs to take place. I don't want to kind of set a false expectation there.
And Joel, if you want more clarification on that question, we'd be happy to set up a discussion and show you some of the things, because it's hard to explain it all.
Yeah, it is, and that's a good question. All right, so again, a couple more slides. I thank folks for hanging in here. So let's talk about just an all-cloud deployment, right? So this is where, very kind of classic, where everything is in the cloud, right? So your data is in the cloud, the catalog is in the cloud, Podium is managing it within the cloud. Again, pretty common. And it basically means that you're pulling your data from wherever the sources are directly into the cloud. And again, just to contrast that with the previous hybrid slide, the nice thing about this is what I like to call it, the kind of catalog gateway is on-prem, which has a different security model than if your catalog, potential gateway, it doesn't have to be that way, is on the cloud. Okay. Other considerations, folks, again, we're wrapping up. I do appreciate everybody staying here, only a couple more slides. So, it's interesting for a data user, and I'm a kind of data user myself, when you're on the cloud, whether you're kind of Azure or AWS or whatever your favorite cloud is, there's a common kind of, thought about how do I see my data, and I'm used to kind of logging into Oracle SQL Developer and running a query and seeing things in this format. But gee, now when I'm on an S3 browser or an Azure, ADLS browser, it kind of looks a little bit more file-y based. How does that kind of help me? And understanding the impact of how are users going to actually access your data, see the data, and this is applications aside, right? But actual ad hoc user or analytics assets, how are they going to do that? That is actually another interesting consideration when we're talking about the catalog. And frankly, this is irrespective of Podium. I show the Podium catalog here, but the ability to actually know everything that is in Azure or in my examples here or S3, more from that kind of catalog UI where users can see this actionable data and kind of the way they want to see it, the way they're used to seeing it, and then actually create those data preparations from a simple kind of preparation data flow, in our experience is certainly a much more palatable thing.
Can I pause for a question there, actually. The question was, that is in fact somebody's challenge, that they already have a large set of data in S3.
Yep.
It's gotten a little overgrown. Can this be used to create order from chaos in that environment?
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting question. One of our more common use cases is going into an environment where things are starting to kind of not collapse on itself, but just become so cumbersome, it's really hard to know what's out there. That is one of our kind of sweet spot use cases, is going in, kind of pointing that source and kind of letting Podium go do its thing and start an initial point of auto cataloging. That's a really good question.
Okay. Another question is, you mentioned security with regards to data. How does Podium handle who gets to see what within the catalog?
Yeah, so another good, tough question, right? So you know, aside from Podium's kind of catalog having all the standard interfaces to, you know, Active Directory and groups and you know, Kerberos and all the kind of common security models, the challenge becomes in defining who gets to see what, right? So the S3 question you brought up is a good one. If you've got 10,000 data objects out there, you need a way to determine that Barbara gets to see this, Bob gets to see that, and you know, John gets to see that. From a Podium perspective, our security model is quite simple, which is why it works with all the other models. It is a user, group, and role model where data is tied to groups, so you can very easily define who gets to see what. And again, you can even set it up such that your classifications during the cataloging, if this looks like financial data, you're going to automatically put it in a financial group. So there are nice kind of auto classification things that can happen as well.
And I think that relates, do you remember last year with the Alteryx data breach where they had an unprotected, publicly accessible S3 bucket containing a whole bunch of Experian data? It was open, right? It was not access controlled at all. And it wasn't encrypted at all.
So to be clear, so that's a good point, Barbara, but I want to be clear on that, right? Podium is not necessarily tying up your cloud security, right? We are enabling you to understand what needs to be secure. So that's a good question. So guys, one or two things I can leave everybody with today, and that is just, you know, whatever you're starting with, whether it is the big bang kind of lift and shift approach or more kind of fit for purpose approach, know your data, know all your data that's required before you get it out there, and really make sure you have an agile model for delivering that data into the cloud. And I don't know if there's any more questions, Barbara, but that was good. We took questions on the fly, which made this a little bit easier for me.
I think we are done, but I'll just remind everybody that this is being recorded, and I'll send you the recording in a few hours or tomorrow. And if you'd like to follow up with Bob or myself about anything you've heard here, we'd be happy to chat with you, and I will include our contact details in the follow-up note. Okay, and with that, I'd like to end today's webinar. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.